Kalindula, a type of upbeat dancey folk music, would also become popular in Zambia around this time. The piece, which included members of Which, released the LP Black Power, which included a range of 60s influences, from Detroit proto-punk to Buffalo Springfield and James Brown. Keith Malevu, who got his start in the Rolling Stones-inspired Rave 5, released a few records starting in 1976. His song, Ubuntungwa, became a mainstream hit and is still widely popular in Zambia today. And Amana Z, whose members included mine workers and anti-colonial freedom fighters, released Africa, an LP that rivals the Velvet Underground in clever pop catchiness.
Hello, Calamine frame. Where do you think you going to?
The music reflected the spirit of the times. Zambia was far from a rich country, but it had a sizable middle class by African standards that wanted to enjoy their newfound freedoms.
Anything that was Zambian, by Zambians, musically, people were just buying. The records were cheap. I think it was about 20 cents. Usually it was the youngsters who had just joined the mines, the railways. They used to have free money and they were bachelors, most of them. And that's where we got most support.
Many bands would tour internationally as well, to neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Malawi. Zamrock shows were taking place in stadiums to thousands of people. As Jaggery told, one of Which's favorite places to play was the Mindolo Dam recreation area in their hometown of Kitwe. There, bands would play on a stage against the lake, and a crowd of miners, soldiers, office workers, and students would catch fish, barbecue, drink, and dance well into the night. Another great band to emerge was the Blackfoot. They had a super catchy, laid-back rock sound, with incredible vocals delivered by lead guitarist Atman Mapindozi. And a band that explored some of the darker depths of Zamrock's psychedelia was Salty Dog. For Zamrock bands, the mid to late 70s were a high point, where they were able to afford some luxuries and enjoy a celebrity status back home. However, what they did not know is that social and economic forces were beginning to erode those freedoms that Zambians were only just beginning to enjoy.
I was making a pretty penny, I was traveling the world, but then we did not realize that the world economic order was changing and it was becoming more expensive to order the vinyls.
That change in the economic order began with a drop in global copper prices, the country's biggest export. As wages fell, Zambians were finding it harder to spend money on records. Furthermore, Zambia faced the threat of bombings and military raids from nearby countries. Although Zambia became independent in 1964, many countries surrounding it were still under colonial or apartheid rule during the 1970s. President Kaunda was not only critical of these regimes, but he actively supported the guerrillas who fought to overthrow them. As a result, the fiercely humanist and idealistic president was forced into a more authoritarian role.
There were two major issues that confused the Zamrock era. The curfew and blackout I talked about.
A national curfew prevented bands from playing at night, and blackouts that resulted from power stations getting bombed by apartheid security forces further complicated live gigs. Bands that once relied on nightly gigging to make a living now had to find day jobs. Some bands did continue to play night shows, however the audience had to be locked into the venue for 12 hours, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to avoid getting caught. This obviously was no simple task for a live band, and was part of the reason why Zambians, like the rest of the world, were starting to shift towards disco.
It was easier for a DJ to play different bands in his disco house than to listen to one band.
Despite all the setbacks, some Zamrockers continued to play music. Ricky Ilalonga would continue playing in bands until he eventually moved to Denmark in the 80s. Paul Ngozi stayed in Zambia and was one of the few to maintain a successful career, in part because he adjusted to the now popular Kalendula style of music. Jaggery left Witch at the end of the 70s and took a position teaching music at a Lusaka college. He had just started a family and was looking for more stable work. In 1984, Zambia's first case of HIV was reported, and by 1990, about 13% of the adult population was infected. Particularly vulnerable were the musicians who continued their rock and roll lifestyles. Sadly, almost all of the original Zamrockers would pass away from what's believed to be AIDS-related complications. Only a lucky few, like Jaggery and Ililonga, who got out of the music industry or left the country, have survived today.
I'm not saying I'm clever. I'm not saying I'm clever, that's why I'm alive. No. It's not that my friends were careless, were reckless, but they were living in self-denial. And then also they didn't have means to go to good hospitals and see proper doctors who tell them what to do. But looking at the number of people that died, by now we would have been making different music.